The winter Robert Duvall stepped off that bus in New York, it felt less like a city and more like a test. The wind didn't just blow, it sliced. It came around corners like it was looking for him personally, searching for the boy who had walked away from uniforms and tradition to chase something as fragile as a dream. He clutched a cheap suitcase that rattled when he set it down, the handle already loose, the fabric already tired. Inside were a few shirts, a worn coat, a pair of shoes that had already seen too many miles, and the certainty that this was his only shot. New York didn't welcome Robert Duvall. New York barely noticed him. The streets pulsed with people who moved fast, who already knew where they were going, who had somewhere to be. Robert Duvall had an address on a scrap of paper and a room he hadn't seen yet. He walked for blocks, breath sharp in his chest, fingers stinging from the cold that seeped through his gloves. The buildings leaned over him like judges. Every step felt like a question he had to answer with stubbornness alone. The room, when he found it, was smaller than he'd imagined. Calling it an apartment felt like a joke. 4 walls, peeling paint, a bed that creaked when he sat down. A single crooked window with glass so thin it barely kept the wind out. The radiator in the corner coughed more than it worked. When it was silent, the cold crept in and curled around his bones. He set his suitcase down, sat on the mattress, and let the word actor float in the air like a challenge. Robert Duvall didn't arrive in New York with promises waiting for him. There was no agent, no contract, no role. There was only the neighborhood playhouse, Sanford Meisner's classes, and a quiet fire inside him that refused to go out. That fire was all he had, and it had to be enough. The first time Robert Duvall walked into the playhouse, he carried the weight of his family's doubt on his shoulders. His father had expected a commission, not a conservatory. His father trusted orders, not emotions. But here, in this cramped, humming building, no one cared about ranks or titles. They cared about truth. They cared about whether you could stand on a stage and make a stranger feel something real. Robert Duvall looked around and saw faces that would one day be legends, though none of them knew it yet. Dustin Hoffman, restless and sharp-eyed. Gene Hackman, solid, intense, shoulders hunched like a man prepared for disappointment. James Caan, wild energy bottled in a young man's frame, laughter always one comment away. But in those days, they were just students. Just hungry people in cheap coats, standing in the same drafty hallways, clutching sides and scripts and coffee cups too hot for their raw hands. They were all broke. But Robert Duvall was broken in a different way. He had already walked away from the life that had been laid out for him. There was no going back to uniforms and salutes, no going back to a father who believed he'd chosen the wrong path. For Robert Duvall, failure in New York wasn't just failure. It was proof that he had walked away from everything for nothing. So he made a quiet promise to himself. He would not quit before the city did. If New York wanted to crush him, it would have to work for it. Daytime belonged to survival. Robert Duvall pushed mail carts through echoing office corridors before the sun fully rose, his shoes squeaking on polished floors as strangers brushed past him without a glance. He learned the faces of people whose names he never knew, the rhythm of elevators that never stopped long enough to let him catch his breath. He rang up customers at Macy's, forced to smile as they placed expensive coats on counters he could never afford to touch for himself. He clutched a steering wheel in the icy dark as he drove delivery cars through slush and frozen streets. Fingers numb even inside threadbare gloves, he counted every coin like it was a decision between eating and existing. Most nights, dinner was not a meal. It was a negotiation. A cheap piece of bread. A bruised apple that had to last 2 days. A slice of whatever was discounted near closing time. Robert Duvall learned to eat slowly, not because he savored the taste, but because he wanted to trick his body into believing there was more. Hunger became a familiar ache, a second heartbeat. But when evening came, survival stepped aside. Evening belonged to the work that no matter how exhausted his feet were, no matter how loud his stomach growled, no matter how much the cold burned his lungs, Robert Duvall did not miss class. He took the subway or walked when there wasn't enough money, winding through streets that glittered for other people, not for him. The city felt like it was always just a step ahead, daring him to keep up in the rehearsal rooms, under harsh lights and the unforgiving gaze of Sanford Meisner. Robert Duvall discovered something terrifying and beautiful. There was nowhere to hide. Meisner stripped away comfort, stripped away ego. If you lied, the room felt it. If you faked it, the silence exposed you. Actors broke down, lost lines, got called out, got rebuilt. And in that crucible, Robert Duvall slowly found the one place in the world where his sensitivity wasn't a weakness. It was his weapon. He was quiet, but not empty. Reserved, but not cold. When Robert Duvall listened to a scene partner, he didn't just hear the words. He felt the tremors beneath them, the tiny changes in breath, the flicker in the eyes. He carried the loneliness of childhood, the disappointment of his father, the ache of never belonging anywhere. All those wounds became instruments. Under Meisner's relentless guidance, Robert Duvall learned how to turn his unspoken hurt into something visible, something living. But talent in a classroom doesn't pay rent. Talent in a classroom doesn't impress casting directors who never see your best work. The stage outside the playhouse was far harsher. Auditions became a new kind of battlefield. Robert Duvall would stand in cramped waiting rooms with dozens of men who looked more like what the posters demanded, taller, more handsome, more polished. Some had agents who greeted directors by name. Some had confidence that came from knowing someone was already invested in them. Duvall had none of that. He had a folded photograph of a life he had left behind and a small, stubborn belief that he could do this if someone gave him a chance. Often, no one did. He would read a few lines, feel the door closing before the scene even began. Producers glanced at him like they were flipping through a catalog and deciding he wasn't the right model. Sometimes they said, "Thank you," in a tone that meant next. Sometimes they didn't say anything at all. He would step back into the cold, script pages clutched in his hand, stomach sinking in that quiet, familiar way. Rejection did not come like one big blow. It came like snow. Small, constant, layering over him until every step required more effort. There were weeks when he heard nothing, months when no one called, nights when he lay awake in that tiny apartment, listening to radiators hiss and pipes knock, wondering if New York even knew he existed. But Robert Duvall did not rage. He did not scream at the walls. That wasn't his way. He carried the hurt the way he had always carried hurt, inwardly, quietly, folding it into a part of himself he refused to let break. He kept working. He kept watching. He kept learning. Somewhere inside that quiet man, a harder truth started to carve itself into place. Maybe greatness was not meant to feel like greatness while it was happening. Maybe it was supposed to feel like this cold, lonely, exhausting, unglamorous. Maybe every step through freezing slush was a line drawn towards something he couldn't see yet. New York was not done testing Robert Duvall. And Robert Duvall was not done answering. The theater was never glamorous from the side door. From the front, marquees screamed titles in bright electric letters promising magic and escape. But Robert Duvall rarely saw theaters from the front. He came in through the back, through alleys that smelled of rain and trash, through narrow doors that stuck in winter, through stairwells lined with dust and old posters curling at the edges. The Gateway Playhouse, and others like it, weren't cathedrals. They were workrooms. And for nearly a decade, they became the only places where Robert Duvall's existence made any sense. He took anything he could get. Picnic, bus stop, the Crucible, Dark of the Moon, Dial M for Murder, A View from the Bridge. Titles that would blur together for most people, but not for Robert Duvall. Every part, however small, was another chance to live inside a life that wasn't his. Another chance to prove, if only to himself, that the sacrifices were not pointless. The pay was small, sometimes insultingly small. Enough to keep the lights on, barely. Enough to put some food on the table, but never enough to quiet the gnawing feeling that he was one unpaid bill away from losing everything. He learned to share space like soldiers in a bunker. Apartments stuffed with other actors, radiators that didn't work, sinks that groaned, bathrooms shared by too many people. Blankets were thin, mattresses thinner. In winter, they slept wearing socks, sweaters, sometimes coats, breath visible in the air. The city did not care that these shivering figures dreamed of stages and cameras. The city only cared whether the rent arrived on time. Robert Duvall would wake with stiffness in his joints and his script already echoing in his mind. Lines to memorize, blocking to remember, a schedule pinned to the fridge with a bent nail. Rehearsal from 10 to 6. Quick break. Performance at 8. Cheap coffee in between. No room for self-pity. No space for excuses. What no one saw, sitting in the dark comfort of the audience, was the grind behind those 2 hours of storytelling. The endless repetition. The scenes run again and again until the emotion didn't feel like pretend anymore. Until the arguments stung. Until the tears came so easily they felt dangerous. Robert Duvall worked like a man who believed each performance might be his last. He wasn't interested in being charming. He was interested in being true. But truth doesn't always sell tickets. Shows opened with quiet hope and closed with quieter notices. Sometimes after a few weeks. Sometimes after only a handful of nights. Posters were ripped down. Sets were dismantled. Costumes were folded and shoved into racks to be reused for someone else's story. And Robert Duvall, whose heart had moved through every inch of those boards, was left standing in the sudden silence, wondering if the work had mattered to anyone but him. He did not become a star. He became something harder, a working actor with no guarantee of survival. There were nights when his shoes were so worn that water pooled inside them when it rained. soaking his socks until every step squelched with a small, humiliating sound. He walked anyway, because the subway fare had to be saved for when he had no choice. His feet grew calloused, his toes blistered. Pain became another constant companion, and yet, in that same city, other actors seemed to glide. Some had warm coats with thick collars, shoes that didn't leak, apartments with live radiators. Robert Duvall would sometimes pause outside theaters where bigger names performed, watching them step into waiting taxis, faces relaxed, stomachs clearly full. He didn't envy their fame. He envied their stability. Robert Duvall's conversations with himself were quiet, but ruthless. Maybe you're not good enough. Maybe your father was right. Maybe you should have taken the safe path. But right behind those thoughts came another voice, steadier, less dramatic, more dangerous in its persistence. Keep going. You survived worse than this. Cold won't kill you. Hunger won't kill you. Giving up will. When auditions went badly, and they often did, Robert Duvall didn't storm out. He walked away with a new scar and a new understanding. Maybe he was too plain for some directors. Too quiet. Not flashy enough. Maybe he didn't fit their idea of what a leading man looked like. So he stopped trying to be their idea. He decided to be his own. He refined the stillness that had always been his. He sharpened the watchfulness he'd learned in a childhood of silence and expectations. He let his discomfort live beneath his skin, where it could feed the characters instead of poisoning his spirit. At the playhouse and in the small theaters, some actors flared for a season and disappeared. Their fire burned hot and then went out when the work didn't come quickly enough. Robert Duvall's fire burned differently. Low, controlled, waiting. He didn't need applause to keep going. He needed honesty. The turning point did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived like every other opportunity had, through a script in his hands, a role on a page, a rehearsal call posted on a bulletin board, Eddie Carbone, a view from the bridge. Just another production, on paper. One more name in a long list of names. But something in that script thrummed against the deepest parts of Robert Duvall's life. A man burdened by his own contradictions. A man trying to hold together a world that doesn't understand him. A man cracking beneath pressures he can't fully name. Robert Duvall recognized the shape of that internal storm. He had lived smaller versions of it in quiet dining rooms with his father, in silent nights in New York, in auditions where he had to swallow his own dignity just to get through the door. Eddie's struggle felt like a cousin to his own different details. Same ache. Under the fierce direction of Ulu Grosbard, rehearsal became a battlefield in the best sense. No easy choices. No lazy emotions. Every scene demanded more. Every pause had to mean something. Grosbard pushed him. The script pushed him. His own past pushed him. On that small stage, in that modest off-Broadway production, Robert Duvall stopped acting and started living. Eddie Carbone wasn't a character he visited. Eddie was a man he inhabited. Robert Duvall poured every rejection, every lonely night, every walk through freezing streets, every moment of quiet humiliation into him. When opening night arrived, there was no red carpet. There were no camera flashes. Just an audience, a script, and a man who had spent 10 years learning how to make his own pain speak. Arthur Miller sat in that audience. The same Arthur Miller whose words had already carved themselves into American theater. He leaned forward, eyes fixed, watching this quiet actor tear himself open in slow, controlled motions. Robert Duvall's performance didn't beg for attention. It demanded it. Not with noise, but with truth. When the final scene ended, when the lights shifted and the applause rose, something in the room felt different. This was not polite clapping. It was the sound of people who knew they had just witnessed something rare. Word moved through the small, dense world of New York theater. Robert Duvall. That Robert Duvall. The one some had called too plain. The one they'd dismissed. The one they'd never quite seen. Now they saw him. Now they whispered his name in hallways and offices and late-night conversations. The Obie Award came after. A small statue in size. A small moment to those who didn't know the story behind it. But to Robert Duvall, holding that award in his hand, it did not feel like decorative metal. It felt like absolution. It was proof that the cold rooms had meant something. Proof that the rationed food had meant something. Proof that the battered shoes, the soaked socks, the humiliating auditions, the winters spent shivering in a city that wouldn't look at him, all of it had been chiseling him into someone the world could finally not ignore. But Robert Duvall did not suddenly become comfortable. The award didn't change his rent. It didn't magically fill his bank account. What it did change was his internal weather. The voice that had always whispered, "Keep going," now had evidence. Concrete, hard-earned evidence. You were right to stay. You were right not to quit. You were right not to quit. You were right to believe that greatness might be carved in the dark. Hollywood did not roll out a red carpet the moment Robert Duvall won his OBIE. Real life doesn't work like the movies. The phone didn't start ringing off the hook overnight. Producers didn't suddenly line up at his door. But something subtle, crucial, had shifted. When his name came up now, it didn't vanish in a shrug. It lingered. People who had once looked past him now looked twice. Some casting directors began to wonder if the quiet man they'd brushed aside for flashier options might be the one they'd been missing. Still, the realities remained. Robert Duvall lived in the same small rooms, walked the same frigid streets, budgeted the same thin paychecks. He still took roles that barely covered his expenses. He still shared apartments with actors whose dreams were fraying at the edges. He still woke up some mornings with doubt sitting on his chest like a weight. But there was a difference now between doubt and despair. Doubt asks, "Can I really do this?" Despair says, "It doesn't matter." Robert Duvall never surrendered to despair. Not in childhood. Not in the army. Not in the cold years in New York. And not now. He carried on with the same discipline that had always anchored him. Read the script. Do the work. Show up. Tell the truth. Then do it again. When the call finally came about a small role in a film, it didn't sound like a revolution. It sounded like work. To Kill a Mockingbird, 1962, a modest part. Few lines. Not a starring role. Not even a supporting role that would dominate posters. But it was a doorway. And Robert Duvall had learned never to ignore a doorway, no matter how narrow. Boo Radley, a name spoken in whispers. A figure seen more than heard. A man who barely spoke but carried the tension of the entire story in his silence. It was as if the role had been waiting for someone whose entire life had trained him in the art of saying everything without moving his mouth. Robert Duvall stepped onto that set not as a star, but as a man who knew how to disappear into a character. Most of the world didn't know his name yet, but the camera doesn't care about fame. The camera cares about truth. And truth was the one thing Robert Duvall had in abundance. In those few scenes, in those quiet moments where Boo Radley simply existed on screen, Robert Duvall's stillness became louder than any monologue. The way he held his body, the way his eyes flickered, the way his presence haunted the edges of the frame. He had spent years being overlooked in rehearsal rooms and audition halls. Now, for the first time, his being overlooked became the point. Boo Radley was the unseen man, the misunderstood man, the man everyone talked about but no one truly knew. Robert Duvall knew exactly how that felt. When audiences watched To Kill a Mockingbird, they couldn't name him at first. They didn't walk out saying Robert Duvall, but they felt Boo Radley. They carried him with them, the silent figure at the window, the strange, fragile guardian in the shadows, the man who said almost nothing and yet spoke volumes. In the years that followed, roles came, small ones, then bigger ones, then roles that demanded everything. But this script, this chapter of his life, is not about the films that made him a legend. It is about the years that nearly broke him before the world finally noticed. Those years did not disappear once success arrived. They stayed inside him like a second spine. Every time he walked onto a set, whether it was a low-budget drama or a massive studio picture, Robert Duvall carried New York's cold with him. The echo of his feet in empty rehearsal halls, the sting of rejections, the taste of cheap bread, the memory of counting coins on a kitchen table, deciding which bill could be late without disaster. So when the days grew long on later shoots, 14 hours under blazing lights, Robert Duvall did not complain. Long days on set were a luxury compared to long days wondering if he would ever work again. When a director pushed him emotionally, he leaned into it. Hard pressures in art were nothing compared to the quiet pressure of not being seen at all. When younger actors on set talked about frustration, he listened. And somewhere behind his calm gaze, he remembered what it felt like to stand outside a casting office, hands numb, heart pounding, praying for someone to believe in him. The struggle had not just made him strong. It had made him compassionate. He understood that every extra was a person with a story. That every grip, every lighting tech, every wardrobe assistant might be fighting battles off set that no one could see. Because he had been the invisible one. The one pushing carts. The one standing behind counters. The one hauling himself through a city that refused to care whether he made it or not. In quiet moments, on his own, Robert Duvall would sometimes think back to that young man stepping off the bus, suitcase rattling, fingers burning in the cold. He would think of the nights sitting on a sagging mattress, the wall paint cracking above his head, rehearsing lines to an empty room because there was no one else who would listen. He would think of the way his breath fogged in the air inside his own apartment, proof that the heat had once again betrayed him, and he would know, with the clear certainty that only hindsight can give, that those were the days that built him, not the awards, not the praise, not the glowing reviews that would someday mention his name with reverence. Those things were reflections. The real forging had happened in the dark, because greatness is not born in comfort. Comfort cushions. Comfort softens. Comfort lulls a man into thinking. He has done enough. Robert Duvall never had that luxury in the beginning. He had hunger. He had cold. He had shoes that let the rain in and coats that failed to keep the wind out. He had casting directors who dismissed him. He had audiences who didn't know his name. He had a father's expectations hanging over him like a ghost. And inside all of that, he had something else that no one could see, a refusal to break. Years later, when people would look at Robert Duvall and call him a titan of American acting, they would see only the summit. They would see the calm, controlled performances, the incredible range, the quiet authority that made entire scenes bend around him. They would not see the young man biting into half an apple and saving the other half for tomorrow because there was nothing else to eat. They would not see him standing outside a theater, watching actors with warm coats step into taxis while he tightened his scarf and walked home alone. They would not see him examining the soles of his shoes, calculating how many more days they could survive before giving out. But the truth is simple and merciless. Without those years, there is no Robert Duvall as the world knows him. The years of poverty, of cold, of endless rejections, of brutal self-doubt were not obstacles blocking his path to greatness. They were the path every no sharpened him. Every winter hardened him. Every empty room taught him how to fill a space with presence. Alone, that every lonely walk taught him that the only voice he truly needed to trust was his own. By the time Hollywood finally turned to face him fully, he was not some fragile newcomer dazzled by attention. He was a man forged in invisibility. A man who had learned how to make silence speak. A man who knew, in the deepest parts of himself, that comfort had never done him a favor. So when you see Robert Duvall on screen, when you see the stillness in his eyes, the way he can hold a moment without a word, the way he can make a scene feel heavier just by standing in it, you are not just seeing talent. You are seeing every frozen night in New York, every thin blanket, every unpaid bill, every quiet humiliation turned into fuel. His struggle was not a side note in his story. His struggle was the story. And from that struggle came the lesson that carried him through every role, every set, every decade of his life. Greatness is carved in hunger, in cold, in pain, in the long seasons where no one is watching and no one is applauding, but you refuse to stop. But you refuse to stop.